Mother and son vanish while enjoying on beach. 20 years later, Dad receives mysterious letter. The seagull's cries pierced the air as David Carter watched his 7-year-old son, Ethan, chase the retreating waves. Each time the water rushed back toward the shore, the boy would squeal with delight and scramble away, his small feet kicking up clouds of wet sand. It was their first real vacation in 2 years, and David couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Ethan so happy. "Be careful, sweetie," Lillian called out from her spot beneath their beach umbrella. She lowered her book, her eyes tracking their son's movement with that mixture of joy and worry that seemed uniquely maternal. The morning sun caught her honey blonde hair, making it shimmer like spun gold. David smiled, settling back in his beach chair. "Let him play, Lil. The water's shallow here." I know. She sighed, but her lips curved into a smile. "I just can't help it. Remember what happened at the community pool last summer? That was different. He's stronger now, more confident." David reached over and squeezed her hand. "Besides, I'm watching him like a hawk." The beach was relatively empty for a summer day, with only a handful of other families scattered along the shoreline. Their spot, about a quarter-mile from the main tourist area, offered the perfect balance of privacy and safety. The coastal town of Port Haven had that effect. Everything felt a little slower, a little quieter, as if the rest of the world had faded away. "Dad! Mom! Look what I found!" Ethan's excited voice drew their attention. He was holding up something that glinted in the sunlight, a piece of sea glass, worn smooth by the waves. "That's beautiful, honey," Lillian called back. "Why don't you add it to your collection?" Ethan beamed, carefully placing the sea glass in the small bucket they'd brought for his treasures. As he straightened up, something else caught his attention. His head tilted to one side, curiosity playing on his face. "What's that house over there?" he asked, pointing down the beach. David followed his son's gesture. About 200 yards away, partially hidden behind a cluster of weather-beaten dunes, stood an old Victorian beach house. Its weathered gray siding and tall windows gave it an almost skeletal appearance against the bright blue sky. Something about it seemed off. Despite the perfect beach weather, all its shutters were closed tight. "I didn't notice that before," Lillian said, standing up for a better look. "It's kind of beautiful, in a creepy sort of way." An elderly couple walking nearby overheard their conversation. The woman's face darkened, and she grabbed her husband's arm. "You folks aren't from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of concern. "No, we're just here for the week," David replied. "Is something wrong with that house?" The elderly man shook his head slowly. "That's the old Morrison place. Been empty for decades. Locals don't go near it." "Why not?" Ethan asked, suddenly appearing at David's side, his eyes wide with curiosity. The elderly woman hesitated, glancing at Ethan before speaking. "There are stories. People who've gone inside and never come out. Others who've seen strange lights, heard voices. Best to stay away, if you asked me." "Oh, come on," David chuckled, though something in the woman's tone made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "I'm sure there's a logical explanation. Believe what you want," the elderly man said, already turning away. "But keep your family away from that place. Some things can't be explained by logic." The couple continued their walk, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. "Can we go look at it?" Ethan asked, bouncing on his toes. "Please? It'll be like an adventure." "Absolutely not," David said firmly. "We don't go into abandoned buildings, buddy. They're not safe." "But Dad..." "Your father's right," Lillian interrupted, but David could see the spark of interest in her eyes. She'd always had a weakness for mysteries, for unexplained things. It was one of the things he loved about her, even if it sometimes drove him crazy. They tried to return to their peaceful morning, but David noticed both Lillian and Ethan stealing glances at the house. The warnings seemed to have only increased their curiosity. As the day wore on, more locals passed by, and each one had a different story about the house. A drowning. A disappearance. A curse. Each tale more fantastic than the last. Around mid-afternoon, David dozed off in his chair. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when a cold breeze woke him. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the beach. He blinked, disoriented, and realized he was alone under the umbrella. "Lil?" he called out, sitting up. "Ethan?" No answer. He stood, scanning the beach. Their belongings were still there. Lillian's book face down on her towel, Ethan's bucket of sea glass next to his sandcastle. But his wife and son were nowhere in sight. That's when he saw their footprints in the sand, leading toward the old house. "No," he whispered, his heart beginning to race. "No, no, no." David ran, following the tracks. They went straight to the house, up the worn wooden steps of the back porch, and stopped at the door, which was slightly ajar. "Lillian!" he shouted, pushing the door open. "Ethan!" The interior was dark and musty. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light that managed to penetrate the closed shutters. The floor creaked beneath his feet as he moved from room to room, calling their names with increasing desperation. But the house was empty. No sign of disturbance. No indication anyone had been there at all, except for those footprints in the sand, footprints that were even now being erased by the rising wind. As the sun began to set, casting the beach house in deep shadows, David stood in the entrance hall, his world crumbling around him. His wife and son had vanished without a trace, as if they'd simply ceased to exist the moment they crossed the threshold. And somewhere, in the deepening darkness of the house, he thought he heard the faint echo of a child's laughter. 20 years could change everything and nothing at all. David Carter stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man who stared back. Gray had long since claimed his temples, and deep lines were etched around his eyes, eyes that had spent countless nights scanning missing persons reports, following false leads, and searching for answers that never came. The bathroom counter was cluttered with orange prescription bottles, each a testament to the toll 2 decades of uncertainty had taken. Sleep aids, anti-anxiety medication, antidepressants. They helped him function, helped him maintain his job as an accountant, helped him pretend he was still part of the world of the living. But they couldn't fill the void where his family should have been. "Happy birthday, Ethan," he whispered to the empty apartment. His son would be 27 today. Would he have gone to college? Found love? Given David grandchildren? The questions haunted him like ghosts, never letting him rest. David's morning routine was mechanical, perfected through years of necessary repetition. Shower, medications, coffee, toast he couldn't taste. The news droned on his TV, background noise to keep the silence at bay. He'd moved away from Port Haven years ago, unable to bear the pitying looks, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Seattle was different. Here, he was just another face in the crowd, another story of loss in a city full of them. The investigation into Lillian and Ethan's disappearance had been extensive but futile. The police had searched the beach house repeatedly, brought in dogs, forensics teams, even specialized equipment to check for hidden rooms or passages. Nothing. The structure was exactly what it appeared to be, an abandoned Victorian home with no signs of foul play, no evidence of what had happened to his family. David had spent every penny he had, and then some, pursuing other avenues. Private investigators shrugged their shoulders. Psychics offered vague comfort but no real answers. Missing persons organizations added 2 more faces to their databases. The years rolled by, and gradually, the active search became a cold case, then a footnote, then barely even a memory to anyone but him. He tried to move on. There had been a few dates, all ending the same way, with kind women gently suggesting he wasn't ready, that he was still living in that moment 20 years ago, when everything changed. They were right, of course. How could he move forward when half of his heart was trapped in the past? The mail slot clinked, and David glanced at the clock. 10:15 a.m. Right on schedule. He walked to the front door, gathering the usual mix of bills and junk mail. But something was different today. Among the glossy advertisements and white envelopes was a yellowed envelope that looked decades old. No return address. His name and address written in flowing, careful cursive that seemed eerily familiar. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, similarly aged, with just a few lines of text. They are still inside. But time does not move for them as it does for you. Below these words was an address he'd never forgotten, 1247 Ocean View Drive, Port Haven. David sank into his armchair, the letter falling from his numb fingers. The handwriting, it was Lillian's. He'd know it anywhere. He'd spent years looking at their wedding cards, her old journals, anything to keep her memory alive. But this was impossible. The letter looked old, yet the ink was fresh, the paper crisp despite its yellowed appearance. He grabbed his phone, dialing the number of Detective Sarah Martinez, the only investigator who'd never completely given up on the case. "Carter?" Her voice was cautious. She'd learned to expect the worst when he called. "What's wrong?" "I received a letter," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "In Lillian's handwriting. About them." The silence on the other end was heavy. "David," she said finally, "we've been through this. The handwriting analyst. This is different," he interrupted. "The paper, the ink, there's something wrong about it. Something impossible. Don't do this to yourself," Martinez said softly. "You've made progress. Your therapist said." "To hell with progress." The words exploded out of him. "To hell with moving on. My wife wrote this letter. My wife, who hasn't aged a day in 20 years according to this message. What if all those stories about the house were true?" Another long pause. "What are you planning to do?" David looked at the letter again, at the familiar curves and loops of Lillian's handwriting. "I'm going back to Port Haven. David, please." He hung up, already moving. Within an hour, he had packed a small bag and booked a flight. His hands shook as he researched the old beach house online. It was still there, still abandoned. Development had sprung up around it, but the property itself remained untouched, protected by local historical preservation laws. As he drove to the airport, memories flooded back. Ethan's laughter as he chased the waves, Lillian's smile as she watched them play, the warmth of the sun on that last perfect morning. For 20 years, he tried to lock these memories away, to function in a world without them. But now, David glanced at the letter on the passenger seat. If there was even a chance, even the slightest possibility that they were somehow still there, frozen in time while he aged without them, how could he not go back? He'd spent 20 years trying to be rational, to accept the unacceptable. Maybe it was time to believe in the impossible. The flight to Port Haven would take 6 hours. 6 hours closer to answers, or to final, crushing disappointment. But for the first time in 20 years, David felt something he thought had died with his family: hope. As his car merged onto the highway toward the airport, a strange sensation washed over him, a feeling that time itself was bending, stretching, preparing to reveal its secrets. And somewhere, in a house by the sea, a door waited to be opened once again. Port Haven had changed in 20 years, but the beach house hadn't aged a day. David stood at the bottom of the wooden steps leading to the back porch, his heart thundering in his chest. Modern condominiums now flanked either side of the property, their pristine walls making the Victorian structure look even more out of place, a tear in reality, a piece of the past refusing to yield to the present. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the sea oats, but they seemed to move wrong, bending in impossible directions. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees since he'd left his rental car, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. "I'm here," he whispered, unsure if he was speaking to himself, to the house, or to the family he'd lost within its walls. The letter was folded in his pocket, Lillian's impossible handwriting burning against his skin like a brand. The steps creaked beneath his weight, each one a familiar note in a song he tried to forget. The back door was locked this time, but the key he'd gotten from the Historical Society turned smoothly in the lock, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled instead of abandoned for decades. The door swung open with a sound like a sigh. The interior was exactly as he remembered, every piece of furniture, every dust-covered surface precisely where it had been 20 years ago. Even the quality of light filtering through the shuttered windows was the same, that peculiar gray gold that had filled the house on the day of the disappearance. But something was different. The dust on the floor was marked with footprints, small ones that could only belong to a child, accompanied by the delicate impressions of a woman's bare feet. They looked fresh, as if they'd been made moments ago. "Lillian?" His voice cracked. "Ethan?" The house absorbed his words like a sponge, sending back only the faintest echo. David moved deeper inside, following the footprints. They led through the formal dining room, where a chess set sat on the table, pieces arranged mid-game. He distinctly remembered this chess set had been knocked over during one of the police searches, its pieces scattered across the floor. Now they stood at attention, as if waiting for the next move in a game that had stretched across 2 decades. In the kitchen, a coffee mug sat on the counter, lipstick on its rim, Lillian's favorite shade of pink. David reached out to touch it and jerked his hand back. The ceramic was warm. "This is impossible," he muttered, but the word had lost all meaning. He'd passed impossible the moment he'd opened that letter. A child's laugh echoed through the house, not from any particular direction, but from everywhere at once, as if the very walls were playing back a recorded memory. David spun around, his eyes searching empty doorways and shadowed corners. "Ethan?" Movement caught his eye, a flash of yellow that might have been his son's t-shirt, there and gone around a corner. David ran after it, his feet carrying him automatically through rooms he'd memorized in his nightmares. But each time he entered a new space, he found only empty air and more impossible signs of recent habitation. A toy car that hadn't been there seconds ago, still rolling across the floor as if just released from a child's hand. The impression of someone sitting on a dusty couch, slowly fading away. The sound of bare feet on hardwood, always just out of sight. David's rational mind was screaming at him to run, to get out before he lost himself completely. But a deeper part of him, the part that had never stopped searching, knew he was finally where he needed to be. As he moved through the house, the boundaries of reality seemed to blur. Shadows lengthened and shortened without regard for the sun's position. Rooms appeared larger than they should be, corridors stretched longer than architecture should allow. And everywhere, there were signs of his family, not as they would be now, but exactly as they had been that day. In what had once been a child's bedroom, he found Ethan's beach bucket, full of fresh seashells still wet with ocean water. Next to it was Lillian's book, open to the exact page she'd been reading on the beach. The pages ruffled in a breeze that couldn't exist inside the house. "Dad?" The voice was so clear, so present, that David's knees buckled. He gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood in shadow, small, child-sized, familiar in a way that made his chest ache. "Ethan?" He took a step forward. "Is that really you?" The figure moved slightly, and for a moment David caught a glimpse of his son's face, exactly as it had been 20 years ago, down to the small scratch on his chin from falling off his bike the week before their vacation. But something was wrong with the image, as if he was seeing it through rippling water. "Dad, I can't." The voice faded in and out, like a radio losing signal. "Stuck here, time doesn't." "I'm coming." David moved toward the figure, but the hallway seemed to stretch with each step, keeping Ethan's form at a constant distance. "Just hold on. Help us." Ethan's voice was growing fainter. "The door." "What door?" "Ethan, what door?" But his son's form was already fading, dissolving like smoke in the air. As it disappeared completely, David heard Lillian's voice, distant but clear. "David, find the door. Please find the door." He turned slowly, desperately scanning the walls of the hallway. And there, where no door had existed before, not in the original house plans, not in his memories, not in any of the countless searches, was a heavy wooden door with a brass handle that gleamed as if freshly polished. The door seemed to pulse with its own inner light, casting strange shadows that moved against the natural flow of time. As David reached for the handle, he could have sworn he heard the ticking of a massive clock, its rhythm slightly off, as if time itself had developed a stutter. His fingers closed around the cold brass, and the world held its breath. The door opened with the weight of decades, revealing not a room but a void, a space between spaces where reality seemed to fold in on itself. David stepped through, and the world shifted around him like a kaleidoscope being turned. When everything settled, he found himself still in the house, but not the house he'd just left. This version of the beach house was alive with sound and movement. Sunlight streamed through uncovered windows, dust motes dancing in golden beams. The wallpaper was fresh and vibrant, showing no signs of age or decay. From somewhere above came the sound of running footsteps and a child's laughter, not echoing and distant like before, but immediate and real. "Ethan?" David called out, his voice stronger now. "Lillian?" "Coming, Mom!" Ethan's voice rang out clearly, followed by the thunder of small feet on the stairs. David pressed himself against the wall as a blur of yellow, his son's favorite t-shirt, rushed past him and into the kitchen. The boy seemed solid, tangible, but moved with a strange stuttering motion, as if several frames were missing from a film. David followed, his heart in his throat. In the kitchen, he found a scene that stopped him cold. Lillian stood at the counter, making sandwiches, while Ethan sat at the table, swinging his legs and chattering about the shells he'd found. They looked exactly as they had 20 years ago, down to the smallest detail. The small smudge of sunscreen on Lillian's nose, the band-aid on Ethan's knee. But something was wrong with the scene. Every few seconds, it would reset slightly, like a video glitching and repeating a few frames. Lillian would reach for the bread, then reach again. Ethan would start his sentence about a particularly interesting shell, then start it again. They were caught in a loop, living the same moments over and over. "Lil?" David's voice cracked. "Can you hear me?" No response. They continued their loop, unaware of his presence. David moved closer, reaching out to touch his wife's shoulder, but his hand passed through her like smoke. The temperature around her was freezing, as if she existed in a pocket of winter within the summer house. "It's strange, isn't it?" David whirled around. Ethan stood in the doorway, but not the Ethan caught in the loop at the table. This Ethan was looking directly at him, his eyes far too old for his 7-year-old face. "You can see me?" David whispered. "Sometimes," Ethan said. "Time works differently here, Dad. Sometimes we're aware, sometimes we're just replaying things. Like a broken record." He spoke with an uncanny maturity, as if part of him had continued to grow despite his body remaining frozen in time. "I've been looking for you for so long," David said, fighting back tears. 20 years. 20 years? Ethan's eyes widened. "For us, it feels like both forever and just a few hours. We keep living the same day, over and over. But sometimes we catch glimpses of other times. We saw you searching. We saw you growing older." He paused, looking at his mother's repeating movements. "We tried to reach you so many times. The letter. Mom found a way to push it through, during one of the moments when the walls between times were thin." Ethan's form flickered slightly. "But we can't leave. The house won't let us." David stepped toward his son, but Ethan held up a warning hand. "Don't touch me, Dad. It's not safe. We exist in a different frequency now. Like radio waves that don't quite match." The scene around them suddenly shifted, the kitchen dissolving into the living room. The loop changed. Now Lillian was reading her book while Ethan played with his toy cars on the floor. But there were other versions of them too, ghostly overlays performing different actions from different moments of that same day. "How do I free you?" David demanded. "There has to be a way. There's something in the basement," Ethan said, his voice growing fainter. "Something old. Something that's been trapping people here for..." His form flickered violently. "Dad, you have to hurry. The loops are getting shorter. Soon we won't be able to break free of them at all. Tell me what to do." "Find the origin. Find out why." Ethan's voice cut out, his form stuttering like a bad transmission. When it stabilized, he was back in the loop, playing with his cars, unaware of David's presence. The room began to shift again, but this time more violently. The walls rippled like water, and David caught glimpses of other moments, other loops. Lillian screaming his name, Ethan crying in a corner, both of them pounding on invisible barriers trying to escape. Each vision lasted only a second before being replaced by another, the house showing him 20 years of trapped moments all at once. A door slammed somewhere in the house, and the temperature dropped dramatically. David's breath came out in white clouds. The loops suddenly stopped, leaving him in a version of the house that was dark and empty, save for the sound of something heavy dragging itself up from the basement. "Dad!" Ethan's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "You have to find out why. Why is it keeping us? Why does it need?" His voice cut off as heavy footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. David turned slowly toward the basement door, which was opening with agonizing slowness. Beyond it was a darkness deeper than night, and in that darkness, something waited, something that had been collecting souls and memories for far longer than 20 years. The air grew thick with the weight of accumulated time, and David realized he was about to face the source of the curse that had stolen his family. But as the basement door creaked fully open, he also realized that knowing the truth might cost him everything. From the darkness emerged a figure that seemed woven from shadows and grief, a man in antiquated clothes, his form transparent yet somehow more solid than the time-lost echoes of Lillian and Ethan. His face was gaunt, carved with an anguish that David recognized all too well. It was the face of a father who had lost everything. "You're him, aren't you?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "The original owner. Morrison." The figure inclined his head slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "Thomas Morrison. Though names mean little here, in this place between moments." The house groaned around them, and the air filled with whispers, fragments of conversations, crying, pleading, all the accumulated sounds of trapped souls. David could hear Lillian and Ethan among them, their voices weaving through the chorus of the lost. "Why?" David demanded. "Why did you take them?" "I didn't take them." Morrison's form flickered like a candle flame. "The house did. The house takes those who remind it of what was lost. Your wife's protective nature, your son's innocence, they echo my Elizabeth." "Elizabeth?" "My daughter." Morrison's eyes grew distant. "She was 7, just like your boy. The water took her. I watched from this very house as the waves claimed her, too far to reach her, too slow to save her." His form stuttered, replaying the moment of reaching out toward the ocean. "I couldn't accept it. Wouldn't accept it." The walls of the house rippled, and suddenly David was watching a scene from the past. A desperate man surrounded by ancient books, arcane symbols drawn on the floor, candles burning with unnatural flames. "I found a way to trap time," Morrison continued. "To create a space where moments could be preserved, where death could not touch those within. I thought I could save her." He laughed bitterly. "But she was already gone. Instead, the house began collecting others, people who reminded it of her, people with the same bright spirit, the same loving hearts. It keeps them safe, in its own twisted way, frozen in eternal moments." "Safe?" David's anger flared. "They're trapped. Reliving the same moments over and over. That's not safety, that's torture." "Perhaps." Morrison's form grew more solid. "But they're still here. Still alive, after a fashion. Which is more than I can say for my Elizabeth." The scene around them shifted again, showing other families throughout the decades, all caught in their own loops, all trapped in their own versions of the house. Some were recent, others so old their clothes belonged in museums. "How many?" David asked, horror creeping into his voice. "How many families have you trapped here?" "I lost count long ago. The house chooses. It draws them in, especially the children. It wants to protect them all, keep them safe from the world's cruelties." Morrison moved closer, his presence causing the temperature to plummet further. "But lately, something has changed. The loops are degrading. Time is bleeding through the walls. Soon, all these preserved moments will collapse, and everyone trapped here will be lost forever." "No!" David's shout echoed through the house. "I won't let that happen. There has to be a way to free them. Morrison's expression shifted to something almost like pity. There is. There always has been. But the price. Tell me. The house requires an anchor, someone to maintain the boundary between times. For decades, that has been me, my grief and guilt feeding its power. But I'm fading, becoming less real with each passing year. Without an anchor, the house will collapse, and all its captives will cease to exist. David's heart seemed to stop as he understood. You want me to take your place. The house would accept you. Your grief mirrors my own. Your love for your family equals my love for Elizabeth. You could stabilize the deteriorating loops, give me my final rest, but I'd have to stay here forever. David finished. Trapped between moments, keeping the house's power intact. Yes. And in exchange, your family would be free. The house would release them at the moment they entered, with no memory of their imprisonment. To them, no time would have passed at all. Morrison's form began to fade slightly. But you would remain, watching them live their lives without you, unable to ever touch them again. That is the bargain. The house trembled, and through the walls, David heard Ethan's voice. Dad, help us! Choose quickly, Morrison said, now barely visible. The loops are collapsing. When they fail completely, everyone trapped here will be lost, not dead, but scattered across time itself, conscious but eternally drifting. A fate worse than death. David closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. 20 years he'd searched for his family, imagined every possible scenario of finding them. But he never imagined this choice, save them by condemning himself to an eternal half-life, watching them from the shadows, or lose them forever. The house shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the rippling walls, he could see the time loops starting to fragment, moments splitting apart, scenes overlapping chaotically. In one, he saw Lillian reaching out in terror as the loop she was trapped in began to disintegrate. In another, Ethan curled into a ball as his reality cracked around him. Dad, please! Ethan's voice was distorting, stretching like taffy. It's pulling us apart. Choose now, Morrison insisted, his form almost completely gone. Before it's too late. Will you take my place? Will you become the new anchor? The house waited for David's answer, its trapped moments balanced on the edge of oblivion, while the weight of 20 years of searching pressed down on a single, impossible choice. Yes, David whispered, then louder. Yes. I'll do it. I'll take your place. Morrison's form solidified one last time. Then let it be done. He reached out with a transparent hand, and David felt an electric surge pass through him as their fingers touched. The sensation was like being submerged in ice water while burning from within. Dad, no! Ethan's voice cut through the chaos, suddenly clear and present. The boy appeared at the top of the stairs, his form more solid than before, tears streaming down his face. You can't! I have to, buddy. David tried to smile through his own tears. It's the only way to save you and Mom. But we'll lose you. Ethan took a step forward, and for the first time, his foot made a real sound on the wooden floor. The time loops were already starting to reform around David's presence. You never lost me, David said softly. I've spent 20 years looking for you. And now I'll spend eternity watching over you. It's worth it. The house shuddered one final time, and David felt himself changing. His body became lighter, less substantial, while his awareness expanded to fill every corner of the house. He could feel every trapped moment, every loop of time, all settling into new patterns around him like planets realigning around a new sun. Morrison's form began to dissolve, not into darkness this time, but into light. Thank you, he whispered. Elizabeth. I'm coming. Then he was gone, leaving David alone with his new reality. The transformation was complete in seconds. David could see everything now, every version of the house that had ever existed or would exist, every soul that had ever been trapped within its walls. And he could see the way out, the path to freedom for all of them. It's time to go home, he said, his voice resonating through all the layers of reality. With his newfound power, he began to untangle the loops, carefully separating each trapped family from the fabric of the house's twisted time. One by one, they emerged from their temporal prisons, children and parents from different eras, all blinking in confusion as they were guided to the moments they had originally been taken. David saved Lillian and Ethan for last, wanting to savor his final moments with them in their current form. "I don't want to forget you," Ethan said, becoming more solid by the second as the house prepared to release him. "Not again." "You won't, not really." David knelt before his son, though he couldn't touch him. "I'll be in your dreams, in the wind off the ocean, in every moment of joy and every moment of sadness. I'll always be watching over you." Lillian appeared beside Ethan, her form also solidifying. "David? What's happening?" "You're going home, Lil." He stood, drinking in the sight of her. "Back to that day on the beach. You'll have another chance at the life that was taken from you." "But what about you?" Her eyes filled with tears as understanding dawned. "You're staying here, aren't you?" "It's okay," he assured her, though his heart was breaking. "I've lived 20 years without you. I know what that emptiness feels like. This way, you'll never have to experience it. You'll go back to that morning, and everything will be new again." The house hummed with power as the final moment approached. David could feel reality bending around them, preparing to snap back to that summer day 20 years ago. But before it did, he had one last gift to give them. Concentrating all his newfound power, David created a letter, not the mysterious one that had led him here, but a new one, filled with all the love and hope he couldn't express in person. He slipped it into Ethan's pocket, knowing it would survive the transition. "I love you both," he said. "Now close your eyes." They did, tears still streaming down their faces. David took one last look at them, his beautiful wife, his precious son, both frozen at the height of their joy and youth, and then let time resume its natural course. The house shimmered, and they were gone. On the beach outside, 20 years in the past, Lillian and Ethan blinked in the bright sunlight. They stood at the bottom of the steps to the old beach house, confused about why they had approached it in the first place. "Mom?" Ethan tugged at her hand. "I don't want to go in anymore. Can we go back to Dad?" "Yes," Lillian said, shaking off a strange feeling of dread. "Yes, let's go back." As they turned away, Ethan felt something crinkle in his pocket. He pulled out an envelope he didn't remember putting there. Inside was a letter, written in handwriting that would one day become familiar to him in his dreams. "My dearest Ethan and Lillian, live fully. Love deeply. Embrace every moment of joy and wonder this world has to offer. Don't be afraid of the future, it holds more beauty than you can imagine. And on those quiet nights when the moon is full and the waves crash against the shore, listen carefully. You might hear me in the wind, watching over you, loving you always. Forever yours, David." Inside the house, David settled into his new existence. He could feel other moments forming around him, future possibilities of families approaching the house, drawn by its mysterious appearance. But things were different now. Under his guardianship, the house would no longer trap and torment. Instead, it would stand as a silent sentinel, a reminder that love can transcend time itself. Years passed in the outside world. David watched as Ethan grew into a strong, compassionate man. He saw Lillian find happiness again, though she never quite forgot the strange dreams she had about her husband being older, searching for them through an endless darkness. He watched his grandchildren play on the same beach where he'd lost everything and gained in eternity. The house still stands today, its windows dark, its presence imposing. Sometimes, people walking by claim they can see a figure in the windows, a man watching the beach with infinite patience and love. Local children whisper that the house is haunted, but not by anything evil. They say it's protected by a guardian spirit, a father who loved his family so much that he gave up everything to save them. And on quiet nights, when the moon is full and the waves crash against the shore, if you listen very carefully, you might hear a father's laughter mingling with the wind, eternal and unchanging, watching over those he loved until the very end of time.